let's transition into what we're here for today. We have the official Brickyard tiers for fantasy running backs. We're here to start out, though. We're going to tell you some of our mistakes in the past, some mistakes we've seen people make. So, my first question for you is, when you're drafting running backs, what's some mistakes you see people do? And then what is the best strategy going into the draft to make sure you get the highest value, not just for running backs, but when you're drafting other players as well?
So I think that the mistake that a lot of people make in fantasy football is they have it structured where they know that first round will be running back, second round will be wide receiver, third round. They have like the structure of when they think they should take a team. But realistically, your positions should be based on who's available. And I said this last week with the quarterbacks, but I think with running backs especially, I think it's good to go wide running back early, but also remember, like, you get to a certain point where you just shouldn't draft running backs anymore. Like, you get to around 5 or 6, and you're dealing with like the Devin Singletaries and the Clyde Edwards-Hilaire's.
Yeah.
Dealing with those kind of people, it's like it's better to just go after wide receivers at that point. It's better to get a second quarterback, someone of actual value, because good chances are once when you get your third or fourth running back, anybody after that, including even your fourth running back, they're probably going to get dropped at some point because keep in mind that a lot of people are just going to drop some of these players.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a lot of good flex running backs you can pick up. And again, what you said, the biggest mistake people make is when you have a high value, either tight end or wide receiver. I got Travis Kelsey last year, but I got him in the second round instead of drafting a running back because I thought that was the highest value I could get for my pick. So it's like, even if you do need a running back, if you see a player you know is going to be more productive, it's like just go with your gut instinct with that. And then running backs, just look for guys who back up injury prone guys in later rounds. So if you think a guy is likely to get hurt and he has been in the past, definitely go after that guy. And then also make sure you do your research on rookie running backs because those guys are either a huge boom or a huge bust. And then also looking at last year, who kind of had a down year that shouldn't have. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I think like one of the players that was a big hit for me last year was Travis Etienne.
mm,
When Travis Etienne was entering his rookie season, everyone was super high on him. They're like, okay, he's going to be paired with Trevor Lawrence and, he's going to have a great season. And then he missed a season for his injury. And when he came back, he was like a fifth or sixth round pick. I'm like, why is this guy so low?
yeah.
It should be. So I took him in like the fourth or fifth round, and it took him a while to get going. But once when he did, I want to say he finished as like a top 15 running back, and I got him in like the fifth round.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Once he got going, and that's I feel like a mistake a lot of people make. They panic when in week 6 their guy's not going, but you don't want him to be really good in week 6 because sometimes those guys will tail off towards the end of the year. You want the guy that's really going to kick it into high gear after week 7, and then you can go on your run. It's like I started 1 year 7-0 one time, and then I lost the rest of my games because some of the players really start to tail off. They had some huge games, and it was kind of like marginal victories at the beginning of the season. But ideally, I want the players to kick it into high gear at the end of the season, end in a lot of momentum, and then the guys that are at risk are those guys in September that are taking too many carries when we should be passing the football because the weather's nice.
Yeah, and if it's a system where it's a split backfield, they're also figuring out who's going to give them more juice. Because like
Yeah,
in a situation like let's think like the Falcons, right? Last year, everyone was high on Tyler Algier, and some people were high on Mike Davis,
Cordero Patterson.
Cordell Patterson. It's like with a system like that,
Yeah,
I like to stay away from committee backfields because that's why I'm always pretty hesitant to select a Patriots running back or a 49ers running back. Um, even like there's some teams that just make me nervous there because you don't really know who's going to be the bell cow. And the Dolphins last year, people fell into that mistake with Chase Edmonds and Raheem Mostert, where
yeah,
they picked one or the other, and they kind of both failed a little bit. So
yeah.
it's like that's a mistake I think people should just stay away from. Committee backfields are committee backfields for a reason because all of these running backs are not good enough to be the number one.
Yeah, and I think also staying away from fantasy running back cults, where I feel like there are names that everyone just says, and it's very like it's definitely NPC behavior where they see a name it's on the TV, and then they're like, yeah, I'm gonna drop that guy, and then they just suddenly like the guy for no reason. Prime example, Cam Akers. Like they're like, oh yeah, he played well when Todd Gurley wasn't there. Then people are like, Todd like Cam Akers is a sleeper running back this year. And then people on NFL Network and NBC kept saying Cam Akers, Cam Akers. And then people at home were like, I guess I got to draft Cam Akers. And then talk to someone at work and they're like, I'm like, how do you feel about Cam Akers? They're like, oh yeah, I had him on my team last year. He didn't have a good year, but like people talk about him so much. I have to have him as my keeper because he's going to be so good next year because he ended the season after they sucked with a bunch of carries.
No. See, I made that mistake before with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And if they burn you like that, it's like there's very few examples where it actually works. Josh
Yeah.
Jacobs is a good example. Joe Mixon's a good example. Joe Mixon, I think, is a more severe example. Josh Jacobs was relatively young and he just had a weird offensive line and things like that, where they had a terrible season. They might have burned you pretty heavily, but then they come around. For Joe Mixon and Josh Jacobs, however, it wasn't that they were bad, it's that they were inconsistent.
Yeah.
Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Cam Akers just were bad. Period. They just weren't very good. They weren't the role that they thought they were. I thought Clyde Edwards-Helaire was going to be like a receiving back. I'm like, oh, perfect. He's going to do great, like a Jamal Charles role. He wasn't because he couldn't catch and he wasn't an efficient runner. And now he might be one of those guys who could get cut this training camp.
Yeah.
So it's like you got to understand when you got to just break up with them, just not draft that player again.
Yeah, and I think the last thing to watch out for is guys like James Conner and Jamal Williams, who ranked in the top 10, were in like the top 7 or 8 at their position. However, it wasn't really necessarily their rush. They kind of had a fluke year where they get like 15 touchdowns. It happened with James Conner, and he was another guy that people are like, I love him, even though he was like a good backup in Pittsburgh. And then he never panned out to be a number 1 RB. And then I had him one year, that year where he had 17 touchdowns. I'm like, that was a great year. Do I think he's going to do it again? No. So I didn't take him again or keep him. And then same thing with Jamal Williams. Do I think Jamal Williams is going to have a good year? Yeah. Is he going to have last year? No. It's impossible to get that many touchdowns again.